In my research, I have studied lots and lots of corporations. Some of them have done a good job in box 3 execution. Some of them have done not so good job. The example I'm going to use is New York Times. And I want you to imagine for a moment the year is 1995. And in 1995, if someone asked you who will define the gold standard for news and information, you have to agree New York Times printed newspaper. Because in 1995, barely email has started. Companies like Google was not even born. Facebook wasn't born. In fact, New York Times in 1995 had probably the best journalists in the world. New York Times as a printed newspaper, they had well over 100 Pulitzer Prize winners. And Pulitzer Prize, as you know, is the gold standard for journalism. In fact, the next newspaper had less than 25 Pulitzer Prize winners. That's the kind of success New York Times was enjoying. It was celebrating 100 years, so a scissors which is performing beautifully. In 1995, one of the employees, the so-called doers, came up to the CEO and said, look, this internet could be a big deal. Thereby, New York Times started a box 3 experiment called New York Times Digital. What I have here is the picture of the printed newspaper and the New York Times Digital on the same page. Now, all of us are familiar with both products. When you take a superficial look at these two pictures, you think the product has not changed. After all, both are providing information. But my point is the underlying business model has radically changed. Because the underlying business model has radically changed, the dominant logic, which can help in executing New York Times printed newspaper, cannot execute New York Times Digital. You have to create a new organizational logic. Let's again step back for a moment and try to understand why is there a business model innovation here. Let's again remind ourselves, what is the definition of a business model? Business model is an answer to 3 questions. Who is my customer? What value is the customer seeking? And what is the value chain architecture with which you're going to create that value? Let's answer that for New York Times printed newspaper. In the mid-90s, who is the customer for New York Times printed newspaper? There are actually 2 types of customers for any newspaper. One is the reader and another is the advertiser. In mid-1995, the reader was 100% in the New York metropolitan area. Why? Because New York Times printed newspaper at that time was distributed only in the New York metropolitan area. Today, obviously, it's available across the US. But in 1995, the distribution was restricted to the New York metropolitan area. And what would be the profile of that customer? Typically, very educated, movers and shakers, very influential people. Because they were highly influential people, even though only a small percentage of the people read New York Times printed newspaper, it had a global influence. It had a global brand name. The second customer is the advertiser. And the advertiser wanted to reach the readers of the printed newspaper. Therefore, they tended to be Fortune 500 companies. And they took a full-page advertisement, a brand advertisement. What is the value proposition to that customer? Premium content, therefore premium price, both for subscription and for advertisement. And what is the value chain architecture? Very straightforward. Gather the news every day, generate the subscriptions, generate the ads, print the newspaper, and distribute it every day. Now, I want you to take a moment and reflect on New York Times Digital and ask yourself whether this has the potential to be a box 3 opportunity. It will have a potential to be a box 3 opportunity if it either changes the definition of the customer or the value proposition or the value chain architecture. And you would agree with me, it has the potential to radically change all the three. For instance, on the customers, it can bring a whole class of non-consumers and make them consumers. In fact, the digital medium could be global customers. They tend to be younger, tech-savvy. Again, advertisers, it brings a whole new class of advertisers, typically other internet companies. How about value proposition? In fact, the value proposition on online media is still evolving. Certainly, content could be free. The advertising model is fundamentally different. We are still trying to figure out how to monetize content. Certainly, the value chain architecture on the digital medium is completely different. So, New York Times Digital has the potential to be a box 3 innovation. Every organization has a box 1 business, and you have to think of a box 3 experiment at the same time. The box 1 business, the core business, the scissors, is what I call the performance engine. Every successful company will have one or more performance engines. And the box 3 is what I call business model innovation. The performance engine requires execution. That's what I call day-to-day execution. And the business model innovation also requires execution. That's what I call innovation execution. And you need dominant logic for day-to-day execution. But dominant logic cannot execute box 3. That doesn't mean the dominant logic has bad people. In fact, if dominant logic has highly capable people, they are incapable of executing box 3. Why? Because dominant logic is constructed for a fundamentally different purpose. Dominant logic is constructed for improving the efficiency in your current business model. Innovation is the opposite of efficiency. Innovation is all about flexibility. Now, think about how do you promote efficiency in your current business model? By making every task predictable. If you can make every task predictable, you can hold the manager accountable for short-term financial results. Box 3 is the opposite. It is unpredictable. Again, you can improve efficiency by making every task repeatable. If you can make every task repeatable, you can apply principles like specialization, economies of scale, and drive the efficiency up, cost down and efficiency up. Whereas, by definition, box 3 is non-routine. The point that I'm trying to say is dominant logic is constructed for a fundamentally different purpose. Therefore, dominant logic cannot execute box 3 innovation. That doesn't mean dominant logic cannot execute innovation. It can do lots and lots of innovation as long as you don't change the business model. These are what I call linear innovations. For instance, I told you New York Times newspaper was distributed only in New York metropolitan area in 1995. Today, they have national distribution. That too is innovation. They went for national distribution. But that the dominant logic can do because you didn't change the business model. Similarly, think about new product introduction. Think about the printed newspaper. If you think of the printed newspaper that they printed 100 years ago and compare it to the New York Times printed newspaper today, there have been lots and lots of new product introduction. A new product in a printed newspaper will be a new section. They've added so many new sections. These are radical product innovations. That the dominant logic can do because you didn't change the business model. Dominant logic can do incremental innovation or radical innovation, product innovation or process innovation, as long as you don't break the frame, as long as you don't change the business model. The moment you change the business model, dominant logic is incapable of executing that. Therefore, we need to step back and say, how do you build this new organizational logic that is capable of executing a box 3 innovation?